The only way man can continue to prosper is to continue to be curious. And we have plenty of curiosity. This is the Be a Great Thinker podcast, examining the world and cutting through the BS, breaking down issues, looking at them through philosophical and intellectual eyes. And now your host, author of the book with the same title, the Be a Great Thinker podcast. This is Adrian Roth.
Hello, my wonderful listeners. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Be a Great Thinker podcast. I am your host, Adrian Roth. This is my special Halloween episode of our podcast. But instead of talking about ghosts and goblins, we are going to reflect on something even more terrifying: real life. As you saw from the title of this episode, I asked the question, should you be scared? And the answer is just as startling. Yes, you should. Honestly, why am I being so dramatic? The simple truth is, it is time to be dramatic. Terror is all around us, and we need to open our eyes and see it for what it actually is. I think the best way to explain what I am thinking of is to tell you a story. You can consider it as a kind of horror story, perfect for the season and also perfect for the times we find ourselves in. The story is about a girl named Gabrielle. Gabrielle is 12 years old. She lives in a large, cosmopolitan city in a lovely apartment in an upper-class neighborhood. Her father works as a city engineer. Her mother runs the household but also teaches piano at home, kind of a side business. Gabrielle has a younger brother, Jacob. He is 8 years old. And she has a younger sister, Leah, who is 6 years old. Gabrielle has many friends at her school. In fact, she is one of the more popular kids in her class. She has an effervescent personality, and everyone likes her. Her life, up to this point, has been fairly carefree, with few problems and no tragedies. But in the last couple of years, there have been terrible stirrings in the political atmosphere of her country. In fact, throughout the world. These stirrings have been very concerning. Gabrielle is not really aware of all that is happening around her. She sometimes would hear her parents speaking about world issues. This usually would happen only when she would wake up at night to get a drink of water. She could hear the concern in her parents' voices, but she never really understood what they were worried about. And they never spoke about those concerns or anything else related to politics or the state of how things were around them. But sometimes the subject of war would be brought up, and that word was very disconcerting. Gabrielle also heard teachers and classmates at school talk about war. But the majority of her class was quite oblivious to what was happening in the world, and most of their parents insulated them from any type of conversation about war or politics. Gabrielle remained content and ignorant of the dark changes happening around her. Because her parents and her friends were unconcerned, she too felt that there was nothing to be worried over. Winter approached, and with it, things started to shift around her. The change was quite abrupt and unexpected. At first, the changes were minor, but still worrisome. Gabrielle and her family were told that they were now required to wear a patch, not just on her school uniform, but also all of her clothing. The patch was in the shape of a star. Gabrielle and another boy in her class were the only two kids required to wear the patch. The patch was meant to clearly distinguish Gabrielle from everyone else. Her parents grumbled over the fact that she and her siblings were forced to wear the patch, but they did not dare to protest this rule. Instead, they followed the new decree and sewed the patches onto all of their clothing. The second change happened soon after. Gabrielle was forced to change her seat in class. She had been so happy when school started that she had been allowed to sit near the window. She could stare out at the birds and watch as the kids played below. But now, she had to leave her precious spot and was moved to the rear of the classroom. Her desk was now next to the utility closet, where the furnace would disturb her when it clicked on to heat the room. She didn't understand why she was subjected to this new change. But again, Gabrielle didn't argue about it. Her parents also did not fight it. She was told to keep quiet and accept it. Things really shifted for the worse after they moved her desk. Her classmates, who once really liked her, now eyed her suspiciously. They would give her side glances when she walked into the room, or if she tried to approach them. She would see them glancing at her, whispering to each other about her. If she came near them, they would stop talking, and sometimes they would laugh or sneer at her. This all made Gabrielle feel increasingly uncomfortable and isolated. The worst blow came when she saw all the kids in the class except her and the other boy with the star patch receive an invitation to the birthday party of the girl who Gabrielle used to think of as her best friend. Gabrielle approached her friend when class ended that day and asked her friend, "Aren't I also invited to your birthday party?" Her friend looked at her and shrugged. "My mother told me that I can't be friends with you anymore." Gabrielle was devastated by her comment, but she had to understand this, so she asked her, "Why?" The girl shrugged again. "Mother says that your people are dirty and they don't belong with the rest of us. So, she would not let me invite you." I don't know why she said it, but I didn't have a choice. "Sorry." Gabrielle was in shock as she watched her friend walk away. She cried as she walked back to her home, all alone, struggling to understand what was happening. Her parents immediately saw how unhappy Gabrielle was. They tried to console her, but there was little they could do to make things better. They promised to take her to the park on the day of her friend's birthday party. This way Gabrielle could take her mind off of the party and still have some fun. Just as promised, they went to the park, but instead of having fun, they were instantly made to feel unwelcome by the other guests at the park. Someone even came up to Gabrielle and her brother Jacob. The strangers swore at the two kids and spat on them. Gabrielle's mother saw this. She quickly scooped her children up and hurried them out of the park. Gabrielle was completely confused as to why everyone seemed to hate them now. When did things change so terribly that they were suddenly pariahs in their own neighborhood? A few weeks later, Gabrielle's father came home early. He had been fired from his job. His supervisor told him that his position was given to someone related to the department head. This person was more involved in the government's new political system, and Gabrielle's father no longer fit within the department. They did give him severance pay and wished him luck, but he was worried that he would not be able to find any work anywhere else. To top all of that, Gabrielle's mother had to stop teaching piano lessons, as most of the parents of her students chose to no longer come to her home for their lessons. Gabrielle's parents had to start seriously considering their options for the future. It was possibly time to think about leaving the city and living elsewhere. It wasn't comfortable to be where they were any longer. Gabrielle now felt the envelope of darkness that encroached into her once secure and happy world. They soon had to carry papers when they left the house. It was getting more dangerous with each passing day. Gabrielle heard them talking with family members on the phone, encouraging them to leave as soon as they could. That was the plan, but they just needed a little more time. But time was not on their side. One evening, as Gabrielle and her family sat down to dinner, they heard loud banging and shouting in the hall outside their apartment. There was suddenly a deafening bang against her front door. Gabrielle shot a terrified look at her parents. Her father's face turned ashen. He slowly got up and walked toward the front door. He hesitated a moment and then opened the door. There were men dressed in dark uniforms, holding large rifles, shouting at her father to gather his things. They all had to immediately evacuate the apartment. Gabrielle heard stress in her father's voice as he questioned the men about this order. The men screamed at him and cocked their rifles, pointed it at Gabrielle's father's head, ready to shoot him. Gabrielle's father held up his hands and agreed to get his family to leave. They had only 15 minutes to gather what they could and go downstairs to the street. They risked being shot if they did not do as they were told. No one in Gabrielle's family hesitated, but her brother and sister were sobbing as they hurried to their rooms, grabbed their suitcases, and packed what they could. Her parents threw clothes, trinkets, toys, papers, and anything of value into one suitcase for each person in Gabrielle's family. Then they threw on their coats and rushed to the street, where it was cold and snowy. Several other very frightened families were also gathered there. Each person assembled onto the street wore the same patch that Gabrielle and her family had been forced to wear over the last few months. Gabrielle, her family, and the others from their apartment building and other apartment buildings around them were forced to march down the cold, icy street. They walked for a couple of miles in the dark, heading to the nearest train station. People from the city lined the street. They shouted obscenities and threw snowballs, rocks, rotten vegetables, and excrement at the sullen group of frightened marchers. Gabrielle was cold and terrified. She held onto her brother's hand as he tried very hard not to cry. Gabrielle did what she could to assure him that it would be okay. But, unfortunately, she was completely uncertain of what was happening to them. Her words rang hollow, as she didn't know if they would be okay or not. When they got to the train station, they had to wait in another very long line. The line seemed to take forever to get through. Gabrielle had traveled on a train before, a few years back. It had been a very pleasant trip. She went with her parents and recalled what a great seat they had on that train trip. They traveled to their destination in one of the very fancy private cars. It was very luxurious. The meal she had on that train trip was quite exceptional. Listening to the steam of the train engine as she waited in the long line brought back a pleasant memory, and she could only hope this train trip would be the same. But it was nothing like that experience. They weren't sitting in any first-class seat, nor any seat in the working-class section, but instead, they were shoved into a smelly, overcrowded cattle car. The cattle car had one small window slit, meant for air and a little light. It also let in the cold winter air. The moment she was forced onto the cattle car, Gabrielle felt claustrophobic and extremely uncomfortable. She gathered with her siblings and her parents in a corner, and that was where they remained the entire trip. If they needed to use the bathroom, then they were forced to use an overflowing bucket, which was filled to the brim with everyone's waste. There was no food, no water, and only sticky, itchy, and smelly straw to lie upon for sleep. Throughout the impossibly long trip, people were moaning, coughing, and crying. Some of the passengers tried to liven up the mood by getting others to sing or tell stories. Just something, anything, to pass the time as they traveled further and further from their beloved homes to an uncertain and frightening future. Gabrielle heard some of the passengers speak about a terrible location where they were possibly being sent to. Some of the younger, more agile boys tried to sneak a peek out the small window to see if they could gauge the landscape, call out on what they saw, and then maybe this would help the others to get some idea of where they were being taken. By the sights of the towns and the look of the locations that they passed, many people realized the train was going east. Gabrielle heard some people very distressed about this. It appeared by their reactions that this was a terrible situation for everyone. Gabrielle wasn't sure how long they had been traveling. It seemed days, though likely not more than maybe 2 days. The cattle car was filthy. The stench was unbearable, and there was no way to feel anything but uncomfortable and terrified. It was dark when the train pulled into its final destination and came to a stop. The cattle car doors were shoved open, and everyone was dramatically forced off. Bright, blinding lights, barking dogs, and many men and women in dark uniforms awaited the frightened passengers. They were screamed at as they got off the train. Gabrielle's parents pulled their children close to them, determined to keep the family together through the chaos. They all stood shivering in the cold, waiting in terror, wondering what was going to happen next. A top military officer, the head of the camp, walked along the line of fresh prisoners. He wore a long overcoat, an official cap, and he carried a walking stick. With that walking stick, he would point to the people from the train. He used the stick to determine which person would go to the left and which person would go to the right. Gabrielle watched in horror as families were torn apart, pleading desperately to the unfazed military officer to keep their families together. These family members would hug each other, crying and screaming, as they were being torn apart, forced to go to their chosen sides. Then it was Gabrielle and her family's turn. The cruel officer stepped up to Gabrielle, her parents, and her siblings. He squinted his eyes as he glanced at each of them. Gabrielle's father was behind her. She felt his arms surround her waist, protecting her. The officer lifted his gloved hand to cough. He directed his walking stick at Gabrielle's mother and siblings and pointed it to the right. He then shoved the walking stick into Gabrielle's chest and stared at her and her father's eyes and directed them to go left. Gabrielle and all of her family burst into tears. Much like all the other families had before them, they hugged each other, not wanting to separate. 2 other officers stepped in, brutally shoving Gabrielle and her family apart, forcing each person to go either to the right or to the left as they were told. Gabrielle clutched her father's hand, and together they moved to the line on the left, while her mother and siblings moved to the right. Gabrielle searched the crowd for her mother and her siblings. She spotted them walking towards a large building. Gabrielle could see her mother clinging tightly to her brother and sister's hands. Smoke and ashes billowed from the tall brick stacks of the building they were going towards. The ash rained down like snowflakes to the hard ground below. It would be the last time Gabrielle would see them. Her mother and her brother Jacob and her sister Leah were walking straight to their death. Gabrielle and her father were also eventually separated. Gabrielle's long hair was cut off, and she was forced to wear an itchy outfit that was eaten up by moth holes. She was given putrid slop for food, but at that point, she was so hungry she would eat anything. She was put to work, separating clothes from the incoming train cars. Later, she would sew badges on uniforms. Her father worked in the large building, the one where they had taken Gabrielle's mother and siblings. He didn't last long. At some point, he was shot and killed by a drunken officer who didn't think he was working quickly enough. Gabrielle survived the ordeal, but only barely. She remained at the concentration camp for almost 3 years, watching others come and go. Hunger and sickness ravaged her body. She survived that, and constant assaults from officers who used and abused her. When the camp was finally liberated by American soldiers, there was very little left of the happy-go-lucky girl who once lived a charmed life with her beloved family. Her life was altered inextricably, and she would never be the same. That old life was nothing but a distant memory. But the terror she endured was finally over. She was once again safe. She could once again be free. Except Gabrielle had a new way of looking at the world. It was no longer through the eyes and the fantasies of a child, but instead, through the starkness of a young woman who had been through more horror than any person could truly endure. The story of Gabrielle is one that many Jews of Europe experienced during World War II. It is also one that many other groups of people have experienced not only during that particular war, but in too many other subsequent wars. You might say, no, nothing like that can happen here. I used to also feel that way. I don't feel that way any longer. Before they were put through hell, Gabrielle and her family felt that atrocities like the ones they were put through were simply not possible. These were just ghost stories they would tell each other in the darkness of their safe and secure homes. But with the changing political climate, with their country caught up in war, and with being surrounded by people who were burning inside with hatred and a sense of self-righteousness which made them believe that they had the right and the ability to hurt or even kill those who did not follow the same cause or who were in any way different, had ultimately changed the horror story into a reality. Gabrielle and her family and her people were now the enemy. In their minds, those who hated them felt that as the enemy, they had to be destroyed. Because of this attitude, Gabrielle and her family were summarily dehumanized. People that had once liked them, worked with them, broke bread with them, began feeling as if they were no longer part of their society. They believed the lies and rumors that were spread about them, the Jews in this case. It made it easy to dismiss Gabrielle and her family and the other Jews who lived in their town. They were seen as the other, and this stigmatized them. No one stood up for them or felt bad if they were eliminated. All of this made this type of horrific scenario a reality. So, if you don't think it can happen here, think again, because, I hate to tell you, it is already happening. We are on the cusp of living that same nightmare right now. On that note, we will take a very short break. When we return, I will delve deeper into what I am feeling may end up being a very terrifying future for many of us. That is, if we are not more aware of the dangers we are facing.
Tired of the bull? The gaslighting? Stupid conspiracy theories? The dumbing down of the rhetoric in our society? Do you feel you are not being heard, while at the same time you are being drowned out by loud, obnoxious, uninformed, fearmongering voices? Then it's time to join our new movement and stop the insanity. Become a member of the critical thinking revolution. Tell everyone how smart, how enlightened, and how informed you really are. Show off your membership into this new revolution by purchasing Critical Thinking Revolution merch. The merch is found on our website, beagreatthinker.com. Our merch can also be purchased at our Great Thinker stores on both Etsy and on eBay. So be proud, stay strong, and be a great thinker. And together we will become a real force, being part of the critical thinking revolution.
You're listening to the Be a Great Thinker podcast. We're bringing back the art of critical thinking.
Welcome back to this special Halloween episode of the Be a Great Thinker podcast. I do realize that this is a very dark subject that we are examining. I want that darkness to be shown for what it is. Part of what I seek is to look beyond what we have always accepted as reality, because that is where we often fall into traps. Many of you listening to this podcast believe in the exceptionalism of this country. Though the country does aspire to that exceptionalism, America has to grapple with its own dark history. That dark history goes as far back as to when the first white settlers stepped foot onto the North American continent. You can go back as far as the Vikings, or to when Christopher Columbus brutally slaughtered and enslaved the indigenous peoples of the countries he and his fellow crew members claimed to have conquered. Or to the white settlers of England who landed on the shores of America. These white settlers were immediately hostile to those who had lived on the lands of this country and had lived here for thousands of years. The white settlers saw the indigenous peoples as less than themselves. They were uneducated savages, unworthy to hold the wealth that the lands of America rendered. Because of their own feelings of exceptionalism, the white settlers clashed with the natives. Some of the indigenous peoples fought back. They weren't going to lose their lands to these invaders. But they could not fight so easily against the white settlers' more advanced weaponry. They were unable to withstand the influx of diseases that the white settlers brought. They could not overcome the power of European capitalism and the force of European monarchs hungry to advance their cultures and their wealth in these so-called new, undiscovered territories. And because of the frequent battles and emerging diseases, these indigenous people were wiped out or forced to live in overcrowded and less than satisfactory conditions on reservations. For those who say it isn't right or fair to say that white settlers stole lands from the indigenous natives, I say learn your history. White settlers absolutely stole the land. It is what it is, and we need to say it once and for all. The next very important group of people that had never asked to be part of the newly established colonies of America were African slaves. These were people who were living their lives in a continent thousands of miles and an ocean away that were captured and sold into bondage, sometimes by the heads of their own tribes. They were then forced to live their lives in chains, while every part of that life was overseen and dictated by men who claimed to own their bodies. And because they were not considered truly human in the minds of these white, authoritarian slave owners, these men felt that they had the absolute right to do what they wished with their slaves. I mean, the law and the economics of the time stated that they owned them outright. Slaves were their property. They spent good money on them. So, if they wanted to starve their slaves, beat them, rape them, torture them, or kill them, the law was on their side. These slave owners were very powerful and were very righteous in that belief. They would go to war and be willing to die to keep that wretched tradition continuing. And there are some twisted individuals who would like to see those days come back to this country. Even with the abolishment of slavery and the forcing of the indigenous peoples into reservations, the cruelty and the darkness never quite vanished in this country. You can also count the terrible Jim Crow laws, the lynching of innocent black men and women, putting Japanese Americans into concentration camps during World War II for just being Japanese, stealing of Mexican lands from their rightful Mexican landowners for the making of the Texas Territory, and then the demonizing of immigrants throughout the history of this country, from the Irish to the Italians to Latinos, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Russians, Germans, Muslims, and of course, Jews. Though, throughout our history, we have opened up our borders, often begrudgingly, to refugees and immigrants, the truth is that the ideology of white supremacy has never really died. It always remained prevalent throughout this country's history. Newcomers, those who were different, were always distrusted and were always considered the other. If you were among the other, then you were treated with disdain, and you generally had a hard time in this country. It meant that you may have a hard time trying to make a living while learning how to exist in this land of wealth and promise, surrounded by people who resented you being here and did not want you around. For many people, America was not the land of wealth and promise, but a dangerous country. But because there was the promise of success, most people endured that danger and found ways to overcome it and rise above it. We could claim America was so great because the people who were part of the lower echelon of society managed to find success against all odds. They mustered up great love for this country, though America did not always feel the same way about them. It was their devotion and their pride in their working for a better world that made this country so desirable. It also covered up the ugliness and the darkness. It made people believe in the false narrative of exceptionalism. But the truth of that is becoming evident by the day. So what makes this time in America's history so dangerous and so dark? This time in our history, to a great degree, mirrors that of 1930s Europe, when there was political fervor brought on by religious and ideological zealots who considered their way of thinking and living as the only correct way to think and live. We have people in America today that feel much the same as they did in 1930s Europe. These people see their way of life, their mere existence, as white supremacists or loyalists or populists as being in danger. They feel they must do all that they can to prevent what they perceive as the extinction of their kind from becoming reality. They use all of their resources, building up arsenals, creating a powerful political, social, and media network, finding similar cohorts with expansive pocketbooks to fund this fight, and appealing to gullible audiences who are willing to spread their false and hateful diatribes in order to succeed in their made-up war. The American Civil War, World War II, and other smaller wars were brought on by the clash of ideologies. The warring sides believed that what they fought for was a righteous cause. They wanted to keep their way of life status quo, or to change the dynamics of their society to fit their ideology. They would do this by force, or pain, or by causing the death of their perceived enemy. Once these forces were vanquished, the vanquisher could then shower the world with their often twisted ideology. In victories, such as those in the Civil War and World War II, it felt as though the right side won. Or, at least the side that believed in some sanity won. But who really was victorious? Did anyone really tamp down the true nature of evil? Is it even possible to conquer evil? Did they just buy a little time before evil struck again? And what is evil? That all depends on the side you are on. Evil is in the eyes of the beholder. I grew up thinking we truly learned the lessons from these terrible moments in human history. But there have been so many terrible moments, and the lessons are brief, along with peace and security. Human nature, for the most part, is not a reliable source. Humans want peace, but they do not understand how to maintain it. Plus, peace is subjective. Then again, so is happiness and victory. It is all subjective. For some, peace, victory, and happiness can only come if their side has complete control and all other sides are silenced, enslaved, or destroyed altogether. They think they have the righteous upper hand. They believe they are the chosen ones. Everyone else is the enemy and must be eliminated. This is the ideology that we must battle in this country. Hate-filled people, with the all-consuming desire to hoard all of the power, are steadily finding strength and creating such turmoil that it feels as though Gabrielle's reality will soon be the reality for many in this country. Though, it may already be the reality for some. If an African American man or woman lives in terror every time a cop stops them for some inane reason, knowing that they may not come out of the situation with their life, then Gabrielle's reality has become the reality for African Americans. If a migrant seeking asylum legally in this country can be duped into believing they will get help, but instead are used as political pawns and put into a situation where they have no hope and no retribution, then Gabrielle's reality is the reality for immigrants who seek asylum in this country. If a child can be torn from their parents and put into a concentration camp just for not being from the right country or having the right skin color or ethnicity, and then these children are subjected to terror and uncertainty and the possible permanent separation from their family, then Gabrielle's reality is now part of the reality for those children in this country. If you have to worry about going to your synagogue or church, with the growing possibility that someone with a different ideology will show up at your church or synagogue with a semi-automatic rifle, with the desire to gun you down, just for having a different religion or faith, and makes you no longer feel safe in a place that was your sanctuary, because to that gunman, you don't have the right type of religion, or don't abide by whatever twisted concept that he ascribes to, and feels that you should die because of this, then Gabrielle's reality is now your reality. If you have to worry about the way you look, what clothes you wear, how you speak or emote your personality, and if you then just walk down the street, and your mere existence elicits the ill will of someone who despises a person like you, and this creates the possibility of being bullied, ridiculed, attacked, or murdered for just being who you are, then Gabrielle's reality has now become your reality. If politicians and judges make and enforce laws that will subsequently result in causing your freedoms to be limited or taken away altogether, and you discover that when you protest these unjust laws, that you do not have the voice to express yourself, as you once believed that you had, or that your voice and your presence, and those in your particular group who have the same culture, inclinations or ideologies are labeled as the enemy, and made to be the scapegoat of the country's current issues, then Gabrielle's reality is now the reality of many people in this once seemingly inclusive country of ours. Unfortunately, all of these things are happening today. You can almost look at any group of marginalized persons and see that they have already suffered under these conditions. Whether it is the constant onslaught of racist and unjust laws that hurt groups like Native Americans, African Americans, and the LGBTQ community, or blaming groups of people for things they have no control over, such as blaming Asian Americans for COVID, or Muslim Americans for the 9/11 attacks, or Jews for really just about everything. We find that today we really are not far from Gabrielle's terrible reality. Her journey from what she believed was a safe, just insane world to one that was filled with terror and death is something that we must all start to consider, that if things do not change for the better, could be our future as well. So I ask again, should you be scared? Once again, my answer is, yes, you should. It honestly feels as if the world is going insane. At least the world that I, and many of you, currently exist in. Clearly, for those who are aware of their surroundings, there is a dark sense of impending doom. This doom is reflected on all sides. There are a variety of polls that say that over 70% of the country thinks that we will be in a civil war very soon. The reason people feel this way is that the atmosphere in this country, with the rise in violence and hateful rhetoric, the proliferation of guns and the easing of gun laws and restrictions, the election of politicians who really have no business in government and whose only reason for serving in government is to force their will and their ideologies onto their constituents, along with the constant drumbeat of discontent and terroristic ideas, which hits us continuously in the face, directs this opinion. And the stark truth is, we are already in a civil war. It isn't one that is played out on a battlefield with military equipment, although, if we aren't careful, that is how it could end up being. Rather, it is a civil war based on competing and warring ideologies. When the dust settles, which ideology, which side will win this particular civil war? Will the country embrace darkness, dive deep into fascism, take away the rights we have worked so long and hard to achieve, and will our voices and our freedoms that we so cherish be stifled? Or will we ultimately wake the F up and come back to our senses, push out the interlopers that are causing all the trouble, and return to normalcy and fairness? For you Star Wars fans, this would be the rebels taking down the dreaded Empire. I don't have the answer. I honestly wish I did. I wish I could look into a crystal ball and see the future. Although, to a great degree, I already can. If we continue on the path that we are on, if we allow the right-wing trolls to gain even more power than they already have, and thus steal away our basic human rights, then there is only one path this will lead to, and it is the same one that Gabrielle and her family found themselves on. We don't want that reality. We want better than that for ourselves and our families, especially our children. But I am very terrified that it is Gabrielle's reality that will be the one that will dominate our existence. We have to be the heroes of this story and vanquish the evil that is about to overcome us. Instead of wearing a costume of doom for Halloween, wear one that shows the hero that you can and need to become. Remember, on this Halloween, we don't need to watch scary movies to experience terror. We simply have to watch the news, or go on YouTube, or Facebook, or Twitter, and any number of social media sites to discover the truly terrifying. The boogeyman seems to exist among us. These monsters are not in the closet or under our bed. They walk in the state houses and in the chambers of Congress and on our television screen or smartphone. They are constantly in our ear. The only way we can stop the madness and the terror that they aim at us, while spewing their self-righteous rhetoric, believing they fight the good fight, is to fight back. Not with swords, or with guns, or weapons of any sort, but with our voice, our vote, and our sanity. I have left you all with a lot to think over for this Halloween. Hopefully this terrifying ghost story didn't frighten you too much, and that you will be able to sleep tonight without any restlessness. But then again, not being frightened enough by this message may only end up bringing our truest fears to life. But one way to stop this terrible onslaught of fear and terror is to join our movement, the Critical Thinking Revolution. You can get your Critical Thinking Revolution merch online at beagreatthinker.com or at our Etsy store, Great Thinker. If you liked this podcast and want to share it with others, like your family, friends, and neighbors, we would greatly appreciate it. We want to spread the word, get others to see the light, and we want everyone to show up. Also, if you like this podcast, please give us a good review. Please send us your thoughts. What scares you? What keeps you up at night? What do you think needs to change to make the world a less scary place? Happy Halloween to all of my wonderful listeners. We will see all of you very soon on a new episode of the Be a Great Thinker podcast.
You've been listening to the Be a Great Thinker podcast. We take deep dives and look at stories from social, the psychological, the political, the ridiculous, to the mundane. It's what we do. Celebrating ideological diversity and independent thinking. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. But in the meantime, hit the website at beagreatthinker.com, on Facebook at Be a Great Thinker, and on Etsy at Great Thinker. See you next time.